All right. Well, thank you to those of you who are punctual. I know there's about 4,000 people outside the door. It's just the security is very hard to get through, but they'll be coming in later. I'm Seth Reynolds. I'm Managing Director with EY-Parthenon. We're a consulting firm that works across a wide range of industries, but I spend most of my time in the education sector. And we've got a great panel and a great group of people here at the conference. And Edtech is one of those things that, Edtech, we got this. I would argue that we're certainly not, we're well past the early innings of the Edtech arc or evolution. But you could also argue that we're far from mature in terms of how Edtech is playing out in K-12. And I would call it, Edtech is going through its awkward stage right now. And it's a little confused. It's trying to figure out its identity. Now, you could argue that's been going on for a long time, and so maybe this is a little bit of prolonged adolescence for the sector. But we've got CEOs who are trying to navigate that very sort of unsettled market in the K-12 and higher ed worlds. And so I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their companies and the perspectives they're bringing. And then we'll spend some time digging in. Often in these panels, we'll start talk about their businesses and the competitive landscape. I want to start, particularly given we've got a lot of educators in the audience, with the classroom and the learner and the educator, and sort of dive into what these leaders are seeing their customers demanding and the challenges they're facing. Then we'll move to the technology side, dig in on what are some exciting technologies, what are the overhyped technologies, how does it fit into the workflow of learners and educators. And then we'll move to the competitive landscape and hopefully have some time for questions as well. But let me start with Frank, maybe go down the line. Just quick introductions.
My name is Frank Britt, the CEO of Penn Foster Education. When we think about K-12 as a market, we sort of are on the adjacency of it. We're not in the classic definition K-12. We serve adult learners primarily, but not exclusively. We certainly have a heavy focus on high school. There's 35 million Americans who don't have a high school degree, who are adults. They've aged out of traditional school system. And then we have a kind of portfolio of offerings that ultimately translate into a workforce development platform. We serve consumers directly, and we serve partners as well as employers, and particularly some of the larger employers like the Disneys of the world and McDonald's and Walmarts of the world. And so we come at the kind of K-12 problem as there's K-12, there's workforce development, there's higher ed, and we kind of dip into all three. So we come here probably with less specific depth on the K-12 system, but an interesting vantage point on how that's changing and what the downstream effects are for the rest of the career pathways.
Great. Jamie.
Good afternoon. I'm Jamie Candee. I'm the CEO of Edmentum. Many of you in the room probably know us formerly as Plato Learning or Archipelago Learnings. We're a combination of organizations that came together several years ago to form Edmentum. So we really do three things. We are a K through 12 digital curriculum provider. So what that means is from kindergarten through 12th grade, we have one of the largest digital curriculum libraries in the country. We are an interim and formative assessment provider, so really an integration, a platform of integrated assessment and instruction, and then we provide instructional services, mostly for blended learning, virtual learning programs. So we have over 1,000 educators who work for us and really provide what we call catalog extension to districts, charter schools, private schools, offering instructional services for courses that are typically difficult to teach, or if you have a teacher shortage. Currently, we serve just over 45,000 schools. We'll serve 5 million students this year. And about 2 million educators through the various programs within our portfolio. So thanks.
That's great. Jack.
Hi, my name is Jack Lynch. I'm the CEO of Hope Mifflin Harcourt. We have 5 lines of business, 4 of which are in K-12. We have a core curriculum business, as well as a supplemental intervention business, as well as a professional learning business, and then in addition to that, Heinemann is one of our businesses, and that's a teacher publishing business. And then our 5th business is a trade business. So that is, books that you may purchase as a consumer. Most recently, we launched on Netflix, Carmen Sandiego, a couple of weeks ago. So that's the whole kind of consumer part of our business that, in the case of Carmen Sandiego and Young Readers divisions, kind of bleeds in over to our K-12 business as well.
That's great. So as I said, I want to start with what's happening for learners and educators. And Jamie, maybe start with you. When you're in schools, when you've got your teams working with educators, what challenges are you seeing teachers take on in the K-12 world, and how is technology fitting into that?
I think most teachers would tell you that technology is not fitting very well into that, and there's a variety of reasons for that. So what we see is if you go into any classroom in this country and you ask an educator, how many logins do you have to just the various EdTech tools that have been procured for you, either at the building level or at the district level? And I think everybody knows that the two don't talk to each other. So building level purchases often have absolutely nothing to do with what a district procures for you. And so what ends up happening is that teachers will have over 100 logins to their EdTech tools. So if you take that issue, and then you add the fact that we still offer professional development to our teachers in the same way that we have for the last 30 years, what ends up happening is they have all sorts of tools that they have absolutely no idea how to use, and they haven't been given the proper support to use them. So typically the way that schools work is you have a set amount of time you can take teachers out of the classroom, and the funding associated with putting substitute teachers in to cover the professional development time. Very infrequently will you ask teachers to spend nights and weekends going through this professional development. And so what happens is there's a lot of really great instructional technology tools or EdTech tools that are being offered to these teachers, but it's very overwhelming because there isn't an organized way in which they're trained and developed and supported, not just the what to use, but the why. And when we start talking about personalized learning and differentiated instruction, those are just all buzzwords to teachers, because great teachers have been personalizing instruction since the beginning of time. It's how do the tools actually help me be more effective as an educator? And it doesn't matter what state I'm in, what classroom I'm in, I still see that as one of the single most important problems that we have yet to solve.
How does that comport, Jack, with what you all are seeing?
Yeah, I think perfectly. I think from our perspective, what we see, we just published about a month ago the Educator Confidence Report, and the thing that we heard from teachers is that they're looking for technology to help them save time, so it can give time back to their students. And 96% of them think that technology is helping. They've seen improvements, but 72% believe that it's falling short of ideally what they would like technology to do for them, which is save time, automate their workflows, help it be far more seamless experience in the classroom.
One of the things, we've looked at a lot of businesses in this space, and I think a lot of times people coming in from the outside sort of look at an assessment provider or a curriculum provider and say, and get in their minds this mental model that the product is being used multiple times a day, every day.
Yeah.
And I think what actually is the case is that it's much more episodic than that and much more sporadic. But in a world where you're moving more and more towards SaaS-based pricing, usage is the coin of the realm, I would argue. Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about how this fits into the workflow, how it saves time.
Yeah.
Do you have a good sense for how much your products or competitor products are being used, and how do you what's the right level of usage? How often should it be used? And then how do you get people to that point?
Yeah, I think, do you want me to answer that question? I think that it depends on the use case, but I think generally the use cases are, for example, interim assessment. Interims 3, maybe 4 times per year.
Now, there were a bunch of transactions recently where I'd say investors were looking at interim assessment providers thinking that, this was like the guidepost that the kids do every day.
Right.
The mental model was.
Exactly. And then there's assessment for progress monitoring for kids that are, require intervention, and that may be every 2 weeks. And then there's lower stakes assessment that are done every day. So it depends on the use case. And also the purpose of the technology. If it's a pen and paper replacement and all your kids have Chromebooks or iPads, then that's the way they're kind of mediating their teaching and learning experience. Unfortunately, most classrooms don't have one-to-one experiences. And then I would say, in addition to those kind of episodic experiences, there are kind of point solutions that are very useful for remediation or intervention using adaptive sequencing or for independent practice, where there's a group of kids that are doing that at any given time, but the whole class may not be doing it. So I think generally if people have the kind of movie playing in their head that, you know, you're going to go into a school and everybody, because it's 2019, is using a computer to do everything.
Right.
That's certainly not the case.
It doesn't look like an office where
Yeah.
email is like my single most important tool I
Yeah.
use every hour.
Exactly. And frankly, I would argue it shouldn't be the case. I mean, I think for me that would be dystopian. A lot of learning happens through social discourse. And so you don't want these isolating, computer-mediated experiences to be the principal way teaching and learning happens in a classroom.
Which comes back to saving time so that you can do some of these more, a lot of more
Project-based or-
face-to-face,
yeah,
problem-based
exactly.
learning.
Yeah.
Jamie, how do you think about what is the right, how do you drive usage and what's the right level of usage? And
Yep.
how do we think about how this all fits into the workflow?
So I think Jack's comments were spot on. This is the way and when you're raising capital or you're thinking about the value proposition to educators, there's a couple things you have to think about. One is usage. In a traditional SaaS, right, that's like the metric, everybody, that's the holy grail. But depending on the type of product, usage does not necessarily correlate to high or low value proposition. So you've got to correlate usage with retention rates for that product, and
Yep.
that'll give you a better sense, and customer satisfaction, all that. The way that I try to explain it to people who don't understand how education products are used in the classroom is if you think about Microsoft Office, right? And we all have parts of that suite that we like to use. And for me, I'm a PowerPoint person, right? Like I never use Excel. I look at Excel, I never use it. But I can't imagine what I would do. And I know there's other tools out there, but I'm very comfortable with Microsoft PowerPoint, right? There's a real ROI there. So you buy the whole Microsoft suite, and there's one thing that you're going to use all the time, and the other stuff you don't as much. So as you think about the same thing, particularly for those of you that have a point solution for education, you've got to be super clear on what outcome you are trying to drive for that educator or student, and try to correlate that to the value proposition. So outcomes could be literacy outcomes. You're aligning to their accountability plans, which all of you should know what's going on in every single state in terms of what they're being held accountable to measure, growth measures, those types of things. And so if you can, even if your product, like an interim, is only used 2 or 3 times throughout the year, and we have an interim assessment program that most of our customers will use as a benchmark 2, maybe 3 times a year. But what they're doing with that is they're creating a growth measure, both in year and year on year, and it's incorporated into their accountability plans. It is a highly valuable tool for them that you will only see usage on maybe twice, 3 times a year.
Yep,
So if
that's
that
great,
makes sense.
finding that fit. Now, if we go to the Penn Foster world,
Yeah.
you do have folks who are pretty heavily online. That's the whole point, right?
Yeah, well,
So-
I think that we're talking about adults, so
Yep.
we don't think of products in the way that these folks do.
Yep.
Well, we value and appreciate why that's important. We think about more holistically what is the user experience that we're trying to deliver so that that brand stands for something that they have a commitment to and a belief in, and they ultimately feel like we're advocating on their behalf. I think we live in a context where there aren't really any brands in the workforce development community. There are K-12 brands and there's higher education brands that we're all familiar with, but you know, the workforce development market's $200 or $300 billion, and I think if you took a poll in this room, not many people could name 1 or 2. Forget about 3 or 4, and it's an enormous market. And so it turns out that the students we're solving for, the adult learners we're solving for, have very, very low trust in the traditional institutions, banks, pharmaceutical companies, government, Facebook. There's an all-time low trust, and so they need a brand that they can stand behind, that they have conviction will give them an experience that works for their unique life dynamics. And I don't mean that I mean that in an affirming sense. And then create a learning experience that allows them to sort of have it work around them rather than them having to work around the school. And so our notion is self-paced learning is the predominant and best model for working adults, which requires you to have a credentialing capability, technology, platform, content, and essentially personalize it to N of 1 for each individual, because we all have learning styles that are different. Courses are of a different type, and we all have different things that allow us to go faster or slower in our academic progression. And so we are obsessed with what is the learner experience that then affirms the brand promise, which then continues to allow firms like us to distinguish ourselves as a potential brand leader in this opaque marketplace for the working adult. The working adult has, in general, not had the best experience historically in schools. We define that as the middle skilled population. So middle skilled are people with a associate degree or less. And while school in this world and this room is an affirming statement, for a lot of those folks, school has been a place where they've told they didn't have the capability to become their best self. And so we have to be thoughtful about what we're offering them. And I think we frame it as we're essentially thinking about how you can improve your economic mobility and what the skills you need to have better economic mobility, and then what's the learning experience you need in order for that to work for you and your life and your family.
And how do you try and use the technology to create that learner experience? Like, what are the elements that are getting better and making that learning experience better?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's obviously increasing levels of interactivity in the learner experience. This is not a classic sort of text-based online experience. I think if you ask a question in terms of like, where is the interesting innovation ahead?
Yeah, that's where we want to go.
Yeah,
for sure.
I'd say there are 2 or 3 areas that are not necessarily ones that everyone focuses on. There's a historical view that the people in this room have a very significant amount of social capital in your lives. Your LinkedIn profiles reflect that, your academic pedigree reflects that, and the students we serve don't have classically the same amount of social capital as many of you do. But I think that's actually it's not inaccurate, but it's misunderstood. There's a lot of social capital for people who are in the middle class. They just have different social capital dynamics than we do. And so we're very focused on how do we tap into that social capital that allows them to have support systems around them that are affirming, that allow them to, when they hit the speed bump, which they inevitably do, get through that. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about how do you scale and harness their social capital in a way that is right for them and their lives.
As part of the learning experience.
As part of the totality learning experience. I think the second area we're putting a lot of R&D dollars is behind, if you think about work-based learning, classic apprentice models, there's billions of dollars spent on learning management systems to make the learner experience better and so forth, and then they go into the work-based learning, and there's no such thing as an LMS for work-based learning. If you were doing an apprentice program today at CVS, if you're a farm tech or an industrial setting, how does that work? Well, what's the verification process? Who's empowering the supervisor? How do you know that skill verification has in fact happened? What if I'm able to do it faster than somebody else? Do I still have to take the same number of reps as somebody? So we're spending a lot of time thinking about how do you continue to mature how work-based learning happens, including the curation, which is oftentimes where you see attrition in programs that have a work-based learning component to it. And then the third thing is maybe thinking about what we do differently, that we're not really an upskilling company, we're a financial services company. Because if you say, well, why are you a fintech company? We're not a fintech company, obviously.
The multiples are higher, that's why.
Well, that could be a reason, but that's not why we say it, because we don't think that way. We think social outcomes first. But it's because when you're in the consideration set of going back to school, you may be going back for self-actualization, but if you're working adults, it's because you realize that you need to have more economic potential in your family and in your life. And so when you're in the mindset of, if Penn Foster is a financial services product, in effect, of course it involves rigorous learning and high fidelity academic experience and lots of student services. I'm not discounting the significance of that, but in the mind of the learner, the consideration is not that I want to go upskilled, it's I want to change my economic potential. Yeah. And so we're thinking about what are some of the things we can do to affirm that idea and also introduce alternative financial products into that experience, because financial literacy is something, there's a gap. And you don't want someone not to be able to go to school because they can't afford it. As you know, we don't accept any student loans. We don't think anyone should have to go into debt to go to school. So we think you should be able to accommodate a learning experience that works for the middle class in the country without having to have that burden. But
there's a clear return on that,
clear
those dollars
ROI,
they're putting in. Yeah.
And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you measure the learner value and the value if there's a sponsor like employer. There's no synchronization. You can't buy a white paper today that explains how you synchronize learner value and employer value in the same analytic framework. And we're spending a lot of time thinking about how you communicate value in a way that's different, that does resonate authentically with the learner, but also for those situations where they're sponsors, like employers, right, the sponsor can see an ROI, and you can get that interoperability of translation between the two.
So you've got technology to bring more of a cohort-based or a collaborative sense that helps probably with both performance and retention.
Yep.
You've got some that, but you've also got some financial technology to actually help make this.
You have to. I mean, the reality is that people stop going to school because sometimes they can't afford it. That's not a good reason. That's not right. So you have to have innovation in fintech, innovation in exercise and social capital, innovation around how they do the work-based learning, as well as all the traditional core elements you'd expect that we would be doing as a school that serves over 100,000 working adults a year.
That's great. Looking on the technology front in the K-12 world, what are those technologies that you're seeing get some of the most traction, whether it's uptake or just things that seem to be working really well? Jamie?
So a few things. I'll speak more from an equity and accessibility side. So what we get really excited about and some things that we're working on that I do think are getting pretty good traction. So one, when we think about AI, and I've listened to a few panels talk about it, where we're focused is on how you make the educator more effective, give them more time back in their day to actually work with their students. And so there's quite a few technologies available now, some that are here that I think are really interesting, where it's how do you make things like AI engines, grading engines, constructed response more effective. It's really hard for educators, particularly those that are in public schools that have a ton of students, to effectively grade, right? So how do you give them more time back, assist with those kind of assistive technologies? From an equity perspective, people are talking a lot about AR, VR, virtual reality. The way that we think about it and what the work that we've done this year and will continue to do is there's a student engagement piece, like kids think it's really cool and that's good, but that'll only go so far. The other part of this is how do you bring experiences to kids that they would otherwise never have, right? And so we started a partnership this year with Boulevard Arts, which is essentially created, and we're on the side of AR just because kids have access more to devices than they do the virtual reality. Hopefully we'll get there at some point, but basically what we've done with this partnership is the fact that I can go into Southern Mississippi or Chicago Public Schools and I can bring the Louvre, that experience of standing in the Louvre, to every kid on this planet. That is incredible. To be able to experience some of the greatest museums and art galleries in the world and to be able to do that in your classroom and to have your teacher be able to give you that experience is really compelling.
Back to the social capital
That's
point.
right. And so there's a lot of interesting technologies. What I would say about, a lot of people have talked a lot about adaptive learning, adaptive algorithms. For us, I think we're not going to see a revolution in adaptive learning. We're going to see an evolution. And we have an adaptive engine, and our assessments are designed around to be highly adaptive. But what we have to do as an industry is understand that it's really overwhelming for teachers in some cases to throw all this new technology at them. And so for us with adaptive learning, what we're doing is sequencing it so that teachers can absorb it and do something with the data versus, there's some tools and things that have been made available, like literally adapting at the metadata on a very regular basis with the child. And what's happening is we're alienating teachers when we do that. So the way that we're approaching a lot of the new technologies, and there's some really cool stuff, is it has to be about making the teacher more effective and putting them in control of the teaching and learning experience and not off to the side worrying about what's actually happening with his or her student.
So is there an argument that maybe we got carried away with super adaptivity and
I don't think we've gotten carried away. I think there's misperceptions around how teachers are actually going to accept, when and how they will accept those technologies into their classroom. And I think we should be realistic about this evolution and make sure that we're not, out innovating where our system's at. Mm-hmm. We want to bring those tools in because it helps teachers be more effective, but let's not all sit around here and believe that every teacher in this country is going to be excited that something is actually teaching their kids and they don't really understand.
They're just
how
a computer lab monitor.
Right. Yeah.
Jack, what are you seeing in the technology space that is exciting, and is adaptivity overblown?
Well, I think that adaptivity often becomes the proxy for personalized learning, and I think that's clearly overblown. But I do see that it is a great way, as Jamie put it, to extend the teacher, especially for those kids who need remediation or below grade level or even above and need to be challenged. And I think being able to on the fly adapt where a child is on their own learning path and present instructional materials that are going to address their unique needs is something that's been around for a long time, and I think will continue to be of value. The things that are interesting to me that I think are on the horizon but we're not far away are voice as an interface. And I think that what we see as consumers is something that we'll probably see institutionally in schools pretty soon. And it's a very, when you think about the amount of time a teacher does not have, being able to have voice as an interface, I think is really going to be incredibly helpful to a teacher, but also I think for students. And the technology challenge is how do you get a 5-year-old voice and be able to recognize a 5-year-old voice in the same way you can recognize a 22-year-old's voice.
Particularly if you're testing fluency and they're not very fluent yet.
Exactly. So that's a part of the challenge, but I think the technology is getting to a point where you're able to assess fluency and then provide practice to a 5-year-old and to a 6-year-old, and actually have avatars who can work with the children and have them get not just be assessed, but get real-time practice, and in addition give the teacher back time, because if you think about that very intimate one-on-one assessment you do for oral fluency, it takes about 44 hours per year out of a teacher's time to do that.
Right.
So giving them back 44 hours and getting even better information that's not prone to human error, and being able, as Jamie said earlier, to measure their growth over time, I think is a pretty interesting technology that will probably find its way into schools in the next few years.
Is that making its way into
Yeah,
direct-to-consumer worlds, do you think?
I think that absolutely voice has to be part of the experience, and various types of interactivity for sure. And the other force of nature, that shape our world, we serve consumers directly, but because a lot of what we do is powered through the employer relationship,
Right.
there's this other pressure that we deal with, which is not just the needs of the learner, but the expectations of the Fortune 1000. And what's interesting about that is when you serve the middle skilled, they tend not to be the early adopters of technology, but when you serve the Fortune 100, they are. And so you have this interesting dichotomy where Walmart and Amazon expect you to be as progressive as they are, but the learner is a generation, they're not getting the new iPhone, they're getting the iPhone that is maybe a year older. And so so when you walk into a chief learning officer and you say, we have a best-in-class product, they're like, well, where's all the fill in the most expansive thing? And we're like, well, we're focused on utility. We're not focused on just what was in Edtech week last week. That's not what drives our motivation. And so there's a balancing act, because you don't want to be viewed as we always say to our clients, we've never lost an opportunity because our technology isn't good. But we also don't think that you should necessarily have only best-in-class technology unless you can prove that it actually improves the learner's experience. It's interesting about how these folks talk. They're appropriately preoccupied with optimizing the resource called the teacher, and the teacher's capability, and the teacher's empathy, and the teacher's skill set. We're preoccupied with the time notion, but applied to the learner.
Right.
The learner has scarcity of time in our world because they have so many competing priorities. And so we're trying to say, how do you optimize the experience? Our typical student studies for 12 to 14 minutes at a time. Like that's what learning.
These are chunks.
Because they're studying chunks, so you have to have content that reflects chunks, and that you have to come in or out of the education experience in a way that has a seamlessness, because that's the scarcity they're optimizing, which is their time. And so it changes the technology prioritization, I think, a little bit, because we're really trying to, we heard this term the other day that some of my friends heard about, which is, what is your streaming wallet? How much does an average American spend monthly on streaming? It's about $35, $40. So our question is, what's your upskilling wallet? And the upskilling wallet is both a financial statement, is $50 a month, but it's also a time statement. How much time in the course of your week and your month do you feel like you can commit to self-improvement in a way that's relevant to your career? And that's what we're trying to optimize.
Make the most of that time and maybe get an extra 10 minutes.
That's right.
Yeah.
If we do that, we're delivering.
It seems to me that this time, but that nature of the time for the educator, the time for the learner, there's only so many hours in the school day, and being able to extend it beyond the school day, all those things seem relevant. I also wonder if on the K-12 side you see that dichotomy, not between the employer, between the employer being the district buyer and the teacher. I've certainly found that the expectation of what district decision makers either want and what teachers actually use, and even the expectation of how often it's used and versus what teachers actually use, can be pretty different. Yep. And it seems to me that you need to be able to convince the district decision maker to buy you, but you've got to convince the teacher to use you for any of this to work.
Yes.
How do you navigate that tightrope? Or is it actually, or are they fully in concert and this
really
isn't a
easy.
problem?
Yeah, they're always
perfect
aligned.
harmony.
Yeah.
You know, I think for us, it's really important to get the buy-in of the teacher. And ultimately, especially in a SaaS-based product, if you don't have the buy-in of the teacher, you have a sale for 1 year.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are districts who have great ideas about what teachers ought to be doing, but if the teachers don't want to do it, mandate isn't going to help you.
Yeah.
So I think in our case, for our core curriculum, we have a lot of all-teacher votes. So we have to ensure that teachers can see their product being used in their classroom, and then we have to ensure that they use it. And I think that's why customer success is so incredibly important in kind of after the sale, is to ensure that the product is being used, not only because of the fidelity of the implementation, but if you want to be eligible for, continuing that relationship economically, you need to ensure that it's being used.
Which is not fun for someone that comes in from a software background to say, oh, we have to do all this support.
That's right.
But
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about it as well, Jamie.
Yeah, I think from, as you think about just really practically execution, this is why so many education companies have a hard time scaling, is what we're talking about is you need a really large sales and services organization, a customer success organization, because what'll happen is, and at Edmentum, we have some products that really are a teacher buying decision. So Study Island is an example. It's a formative tool that's used in the classroom, and over half of our contracts are secured by a teacher or a principal. And then we've got very comprehensive programs that are designed for intervention or whole class supplemental programs, and those are a district purchase. And so if you start at the teacher level, at some point, you're going to get a lot of teachers using your product and then multiple schools, and you're going to want to scale up to the district. Or you're a district level purchase, and you've got to influence the teachers to get their buy-in to use it. And so you have to think very comprehensively around how your sales and your customer success or your services organization is structured and how many feet on the street you have to effectively do that. And it does take quite a bit of work to be able to both get the buyer and the users to work
together. Can you scale this with technology now?
You can, yes, absolutely. So you can scale it with technology, particularly on the usage side. So that's one of the areas where we've invested quite a bit of our time, is really building out our data science practice, and specifically machine learning around how can we interpret what teachers need from the product given the time, the timing of the academic year, and how do we serve up information to them that makes them more effective right in the moment, so as they log in, right? So I think from a usage and a retention perspective, and being able to find creative ways to train and support teachers on a real-time basis, we've been able to scale more effectively with technology. I think, though, in the education system, teachers within buildings don't always collaborate all that well. We wish they did. And certainly buildings up to district do not collaborate well. You'll go into very, very few districts where you will see all of the building leadership working very closely with their district leadership. So there's all sorts of separation of duty, and there's lots of politics that go on, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But there is, very seriously competing priorities at the district versus the building level, and so it takes the provider to build that continuity, and that's where we spend a lot of our time.
Now, I just want to talk about customer success, or student success in your model.
Yep.
How do you, given that you aren't having students take on a bunch of Title IV debt,
That's for sure.
how in an affordable model do you take advantage? How do you drive student success when you don't have as many tuition dollars to work with?
Well, I think that a lot of times in early stage companies, they say that scarcity is the greatest opportunity, because the scarcity compels people to be more innovative and more discerning as to where they spend their time and energy. And I think we're mindful that our students have scarcity, and so we could always charge more, but that would undermine our social goals, which are to maximize access and opportunity and activation of a population that we feel like doesn't necessarily get a fair shake. And so what we tried to do is to build a learner experience that is high touch when it needs to be, and is heavily focused on self-management and self-service. And so we are monitoring people's academic activities on a regular basis. We're doing interventions through digital interfaces and digital solutions. And then if we see that you hit a speed bump, we have coaches that will intervene, and you'll have a full wraparound service. And we find that that's the right model, because the elusive balance of value is defined as the quality over the price. You can always add more quality, but if you do that, you're undermining the value because you probably have to charge more. So in our case, we think that people can afford to pay about $50 a month to basically go to be upskilled. And so while it might be nice to add 10 other bells and whistles, it's just not consistent with what we said, which is going to cost $50 a month. And so we've used that scarcity to our advantage, and we've been very discerning about how we do it. And then we've exercised scale. I mean, we enrolled over 150,000 adults last year. We graduated 47,000 adults last year. Our outcomes continue to get better. And we, by the way, measure outcomes on a bunch of levels. There's first an outcome of just opportunity and activation is an outcome. Then there's an outcome of confidence. There's skill attainment that has real market value. And then there's the more traditional definitions of academic outcomes. And so we try to monitor all three of those because we think, all four of those, because I think they all are legitimate. So we're trying to slightly evolve the narrative of what are outcomes for this cohort. And I think at the end of the day, what we've seen is that there is a strong appetite for people to take control of their careers. And I think that this kind of education model is right for the middle skilled workers that we're trying to help.
That's great. I want to take a few minutes before questions to talk a little bit about you're doing all this within a competitive landscape. How are you competing to win? Who's taking share? What does it look like? I mean, you're in maybe start in the higher ed side. You're in a very unique niche.
Yes.
Who are you competing with? How are you maybe going at the underside of the traditional higher ed model, or who are you stealing?
Yeah, it's interesting.
From?
If you ask from a perspective of which government agencies own different populations, the Department of Education cares a lot about K-12, and they care a lot about the higher ed. But it's arguably maybe the Department of Labor that cares about the working adult, and the Department of Labor is not an educational-oriented institution, right? And so what we see is that there's sort of this highly fragmented market that's really based on geography. So if you go to any city in the country, any town, there's workforce boards, there's community colleges. Our view on community colleges, a third of them are awesome, a third of them are average, and a third of them need to get their ducks in a row. And so if you happen to live near one, maybe that's good. If it happens to be one of the good ones, but they're not all good. And from an employer perspective, they don't scale nationally. If you're Walmart and you're trying to do a program across all your stores, how is that going to work? So really, the system was never engineered for national employers. It was engineered on the premise that economic development happened locally. And so I think the answer is there isn't any clear competition on a national basis because the system wasn't configured that way. You see super universities emerging like Purdue, ASU, Southern New Hampshire University, who are thinking broadly about education across a nationwide basis. And they're certainly thinking about what part of the workforce they want to try to best accommodate. They've had historical orientation towards knowledge workers as opposed to working adults. So I'd say those folks are the real key players to watch over time. And then there's a new class of providers that no one talks about, like the human capital management companies like Workday and SAP SuccessFactors. They will have upskilling in their platforms over time, and they will become a type of education institution, as will staffing companies. Staffing companies serve 20% of all working adults work at a staffing company.
A DecoBot
General Assembly.
Yeah,
so there's both traditional big players, there's platform companies, SAP, Workday, and then there's the staffing companies. I think you'll see lots of activity amongst those different, and it will eventually seep into the high schools. If you have 35 million Americans who don't have a high school degree, that's a gigantic labor pool that isn't fully exercised, and those institutions I cited realize that, and they're going to borrow some of the best practices from the folks like these guys, I think, to really turn that labor market into a higher contributor to the skills gap.
It's flipping a little bit to K. It's really interesting. Flipping a little bit to K-12. We talked about comprehensive curriculum, and that world has changed a lot. And both of you are in a world where the distinction between the basal textbook, supplemental, and assessments, those lines are blurring. And I think it's opened up a whole new set of competition probably for large publishers like yourself, and frankly for courseware providers like yourself. How are you responding to that, and what do you see happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's blurred. I don't think it's moved fast enough. So, for example, the comprehensive core curriculum providers say that they have intervention solutions, but they're kind of a mile-wide, inch-deep intervention solutions. So they're not really connected to an intervention solution. So from a marketing standpoint, there's still, if you go to, we're in major adoption states right now, you still see, a highly consolidated kind of industry with a few new entrants on the edges of that. But it's more stable than I think people would think naturally. But the opportunity is to have more and more bridges from supplemental intervention to core. And I think that requires some plumbing, and I think that requires, at the end of the day, a teacher feeling like there's seamless solutions where you can navigate from core curriculum to supplemental to intervention.
Does that imply some level of consolidation over the next few years, back to our 100 different products and passwords?
It very well could, yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, for us, traditionally as an intervention, started really as an intervention company, what we're seeing now, and it's very fragmented, and it's not entirely clean in terms of going from one state, even within districts, but we're seeing a lot, like particularly in the 2,500 to 10,000 student enrollment district size, where teachers and administrators are becoming very comfortable curating what they would call their core instruction. And we're part of that now. Whereas before we were really relegated to a supplemental or an intervention type of program. You're pulling your kids out and they go sit on Plato courseware or something like that. That is changing in some of our larger states.
Do-it-yourself, not OER?
And not OER. No, it is, I went through a core basal adoption, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to curate what really we believe is a comprehensive core solution for our students. And in many districts, we're now part of that, where portions of our product are being used on a daily basis for whole class and small group instruction. And so that is a shift. We're in the early stages, but it is definitely a shift that we're seeing. We're also asking to participate in core adoptions in ways that we as a company had never been before. So having SEA state agencies call us and say, we're coming out with this, and this is what we want you guys to think about. And so I think there's this, it's early, I think it's messy right now, but it is definitely a trend that we're seeing.
Do we have time for questions, or? Yeah,
One question.
I certainly haven't left a lot of time for questions, but if someone has questions, maybe we can just call it straight out and I'll repeat it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, is developing a VR product strategy something on your product timeline in the short term?
So the question was, is developing a VR, virtual reality product strategy on the roadmap for you?
We already have it in
We
our
have it,
products,
too.
yeah. So it's already there. We're partnering right now, so we don't have a short-term organic strategy kind of build that capacity. We think there's a lot of really great partners that we're bringing into our curriculum. So yes, and we already use it.
I would say partnering.
Partnering. Is that a bell and whistle that falls into the only if you can do it at $50 a month?
There might be some occupations where it takes on a more significant importance. So I'd say it is more in the bell and whistle category for today at the current price point, but we all know the rules that technology prices fall at accelerated rates. So I'd say if you woke up a couple, 3 years from now, it would be an important part of our overall story.
That's great. One more, yeah, go ahead.
There is a lot of discussion about alternative credentials as part of the workforce problem model with Penn Foster. So, what kind of willingness are you seeing from the employers? Basically, there is a lot of discussion on the supply side, but demand side, what kind of willingness?
So the question is alternative credentials, a lot of talk about it. Are they being accepted by employers? Yeah.
I think that the focus is on skills. I think skills are the currency that matter. And there are various ways to verify skills. Badges are a way to do it. Industry credentials are a way to do it. So I think the higher order question is not whether it's an industry credential, it's is there verifiable skill attainment from the employer's perspective. If you go do a job search for yourself today, the machine that sorts your resume is not sorting on anything but key phrases that are skills. And if you look at the way the taxonomy of a typical learning objective is in an academic setting, skills are in the prose, but it's a learning objective, it's not a skill objective. So what you're going to see is the curriculums are going to become skill-centric, the narrative will become skill-centric, the badging and credentialing will be skill-centric, and if it happens to come from industry credential, that's a blessing, but there's plenty of other verifiable ways to do it. But the arc of the narrative is skill is the new voice, because the real people who are driving the change agenda are the employers, and that's how the employer thinks about hiring. It's particularly true in in staffing sector, for example, everything's based on skills. But even in some of the more advanced jobs in machine learning AI, I was with the guy that runs the Google Knowledge product last week, which is mapping all of the world's knowledge. He talks in skill terms. He's not talking about credentials. So I think industry credentials will come with skills, but it will be in that order.
And that's stretching down into K-12 now too in certain states policy-wise. So you're seeing, Louisiana Pathways or Jumpstart program and Indiana Pathways are two examples where graduation requirements have changed, and so you can actually use these credentials as a path and dual enrollment as a pathway towards graduation, which gives these students additional options other than just your traditional 4x4 pathway that you see in a lot of states.
That's right. Well, thank you, everyone. Kaylee is going to is a tough taskmaster, so we're going to end it here. I'm sure there might be some time for questions afterwards, but thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.